comes with quite a nice
Hello, good afternoon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, wala pa tayong kalahati, Ate Mel, no?
Meron.
Meron eh.
15. 15 tayo lahat.
More than one lang. Ay, nako. Sige, let me just, How are you? How was the, while we're waiting for the others? How was your, last week, we were not able to talk about your group discussion. Did you find the asynchronous group discussion, helpful in terms of establishing relationships with each other? How are your experiences with working in a group? No heated debates? Kumusta? How was it?
Wala po.
Wala naman?
Engaging naman po.
Talaga? Oh, that's nice. That's nice. No, the grouping is a little bit huge. Ate Mel, pa PM yung mga nawawala, no? My office is so messy. It's so messy because I've been sleeping here the past days. So that's my bed right there. This is like my second home, no? When I need to finish a lot of things and I cannot afford to go home. So I'm very happy that when such times occur, Chris is very willing to take care of the the two boys. So actually, we take turns. No, sometimes he sleeps in the office too. So there are days he sleeps here so that he can work. There are days that I sleep here so that I can work. Okay. So how was the group no group discussion? Not in terms of content, no, but in terms of your experience discussing the themes and the work that you are required to do.
Oh, good naman sa akin, ma'am. Wala naman issues. Very uh, organized and efficient, I would say. I think that would define our group.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we have a group here that's very organized.
But it was good also because the last session we also prayed for one another. So
Oh, that's
we
nice.
go beyond the curriculum. Kuya
Yeah,
Wells.
yeah. That's
No.
nice. No. I hope you also take advantage of that to, really since we don't get to talk with each other, unlike if we're in campus, no, during breaks, there's time to talk with each other and ask each other what you're doing. Diba? I hope you can spend some time. And of course, if there are things that you need to pray about, um, I hope you can spend time doing that. No, it's good to have smaller communities, not just for academic reasons. What about the others? Or were you absent in your groups? Any other feedback on the group work? Did you all know each other prior to the grouping? Ah, okay. So, oh, that's nice, no? If you there are members that you did not know. Let's also pray for si Chow, has COVID. The entire family has COVID. Tapos there are a few na medyo masama ang pakiramdam right now.
Si Gaze po.
Si Gaze is not feeling very well, yeah, because she had her booster. Sino pa ba? I think there's one more. Yeah. So paki-note yun, ate, ano, no? Ate Mel, na yung absence nila is because of something else. Claire also is going through a checkup. I don't know exactly why, but Claire is going through a checkup. So, no, and there's so many other concerns, no? I hope
Nalilate
we...
daw si Esther.
sige lang. Okay. There's so many concerns, no? Not just personal, but local. The election is so already so heated, no? It's very interesting. This is our first presidential election since we came back. We actually voted when we were in the UK. You know, we made a point to vote there last 2016. So this is our first time to actually feel you know, the excitement, whether it's positive or negative. Masaya, no? Masaya. I don't know how many of you are involved, no? But it's as people involved in theology, it's good to think through what's going on. No? What is the role of the church? What are our roles as individual? There are people who are saying we should not get too involved. because this world is passing away anyway. I hope that perspective has been corrected already, no, sa inyo. Exegetically, no, that's a very problematic perspective. I hope you've already encountered that. So, and of course, uh, it's understandable that our participation in the political process would not be homogeneous. No, it's not the same for everybody. There are people who are more involved, and that's okay. There are people who are actually in the spotlight, and that's okay as well. No, but it's good to think through this as a faith community. And of course, there is the international, no, the international issue, Ukraine right now. Uh, the conflict has escalated, and there's been many calls to pray for them. I personally have friends there. There's a seminary there wherein the president and a few of its faculty I know personally, right in the middle of in ground zero talaga. So it's been very, very sad hearing about the news there. Well, the faculty of that seminary have fled, so they had the chance to get out, but they were saying that a lot people are still stuck there. And of course, you would want to, you don't want to be exiled, diba? That's like a forced exile. It's not something that you chose for yourself, no. So let's continue to pray for that. And I'm not sure if you've sensed, no, the effect of it on us. Economically, gas prices have gone up. So yung ano to, what do we call yung gas na panluto? Ang tawag doon?
LPG po.
LPG, Nakabili ba kayo ng LPG recently? It's up by 300. Grabe talaga. So I was telling Chris, kahit pa paano may pambili pa tayo, no? At least we still have money to buy it. How about those people who that's very expensive, no? What are they? Parang it's like they're expecting people not to eat, not needing to eat. And those of you who have cars, gas prices have gone up drastically, no? This is one of those instances that drastic the increase has been drastic, and that will, even if you don't drive cars, if you're commuting, I'm expecting rise in fares, no. I was talking to a taxi driver recently, and he was saying that right now with the prices, they only are able to bring home 400 pesos per day, no, after you pay for the gas and you pay the boundary to the owner. I mean, 400, what does that do? No, if you're, yeah, it's lower than minimum wage. And if you have families. So that's very sad. So, of course, people will complain when they increase the prices. But at the same time, we know that the people who are drivers or drive as a profession would be so much affected. So all these things that are happening have an effect on us. Actually, this is a theme in Leviticus. No, of course, in this case, we feel it economically. No, the effect on it, on us. But it's not just that. No, um, I forgot the name of the philosopher. She's written about this. She's a she. Baka kilala nyo. She's written on, she made some reflection. So she's not a Christian, she's a philosopher, very well known philosopher. She wrote a book, not exactly recently, no, but reflecting on the 9/11, no, and how events like this, or even let's say famine in South Africa, for example, which we might not feel, no, but that actually has an effect on us. And it just points out the interrelatedness of life. And that's a theme that is explored very well in the Old Testament. You will see that when we look at Leviticus, no? It's very, very beautifully laid down there. Might not be explicit, no? But if you look at the theology that comes out of the concept of sacrifices and sin and holiness, you will realize that, at least from the biblical perspective, the sin of one person who might actually be, so far from you, have an effect on you. And that's a very, very interesting ethical concept. So I read that first as a reader of the Old Testament, and then I read this. She's actually quite famous. Isaac, can you recall any modern philosopher who's a woman? She
Uh, Hannah Arendt,
no. More recent than her. Ah, I forgot the
Martha
name.
Nussbaum.
No. No spam. Favorite ni ano no. Favorite ni ano. Pero in their league, no? In their league. So when I read that book, it's actually, well, Chris is the one who collects this book. I thought, oh, this is in the Old Testament. The Bible thought of it before this philosopher. But it doesn't come out no in the way we converse about theology. So it's good to bring those out. So all these things happening, it's something that we should be concerned about. No, Myanmar as well. One of the things that I was very sad about is I'm actually happy that people are paying attention at what is going on in Ukraine. But I'm also a little bit sad because it shows the disproportionate attention, no? Uh, and this is, of course, the effect of social media. What is happening in Ukraine has a huge effect on the Western world, and so it's put forward on social media because we are interested in it. By now, we already feel the economic effect of it on us. But we do have a neighbor, no, very close to us, where there's so much suffering. Many people in Myanmar are being driven to jungles, literally jungles, no, in order to hide from the military junta. And there's nothing to eat. No? Families are there dying in the jungle. So these things that are happening, no, let's continue to think about it and not just pray about it, no, but reflect on what the Lord is teaching us. And on that note, I'd like us to reflect or do a liturgy. Where is my liturgy? Nasaan na siya? On peace, no? So let's do a liturgy on peace. Peace is a big concept in the Old Testament. Shalom actually, no, is the word that is translated as peace, but shalom is means wellness really, even if it's translated as peace, no? Wellness of every person, not just physically, well, not just spiritually, but physically as well. So that's a concept that's very strong in the Old Testament. In fact, in the Old Testament, it doesn't have a dichotomy between spiritual and physical. They don't have that, or sacred and secular. Everything else is one. No, so that's the concept. So when they talk about wellness, wellness of the person in totality, no, and wellness not just of the person, but the community as well, especially the marginalized in the community. So let's look at this. After the liturgy, after this prayer, we will be listening to a song, one of my favorite modern songs. I'm very impressed with the theology of the song, and we will reflect on what it says. What's going on? Let me share. So there are two slides. There are two slides here. Uh, so may I ask Pan to read the first slide, no? Even as we remember Myanmar as well. And then may I ask Ate Weng to do the closing prayer. And then after that, I will share the song. Okay, Pan, you can start.
God, God who sees in and who feels moment of infinite happiness through this wearing gladness and share of all in harm's way. strength from the mind that its strength is strong in a pulling force, and may an equal strength and solidity belong to those whose is to protect and respect not just the ones we call our own, but all with whom we can share a better, more peaceful world.
Thank you, Pan. May I read this again, no? Because it's a little bit choppy. But thank you, Pan, nonetheless. It's good to have somebody from Myanmar lead the prayer for us. God who sees the weakness in acts of naked aggression, God who feels the fear in moments of acute helplessness, cure this worrying madness, and shield all who fall in harm's way. Leach the poison from the mind that thinks strength is shown in a bullying force, and may an equal strength in solidarity give resolve to those whose aim is to protect and respect not just the ones we call our own, but all with whom we can share a better, more peaceful world. Amen.
God of peace, we pray for peace around the world. Where there is hatred, sow seeds of calm. Where there is destruction, help us to rebuild. Where children are crying, bring an end to tears. Shelter your people and protect them. Guide them and keep them from harm. Amen.
Amen.
Beauty for brokenness, hope for despair. Lord, in the suffering, this is our prayer. Bread for the children, justice, joy, peace. Sunrise to sunset, your kingdom increase. Shelter for fragile lives, cure for their ills. Work for the craftsmen, trade for their skills. Land for the dispossessed, rights for the weak. Voices to plead the cause of those who can't speak. God of the poor, friend of the weak, give us compassion, we pray. Melt our cold hearts, let tears fall like rain. Come change our love from a spark to a flame. Refuge from cruel wars, havens from fear, cities for sanctuary, freedoms to share. Peace to the killing fields, scorched earth to green. Christ for the bitterness, his cross for the pain. God of the poor, friend of the weak, give us compassion, we pray. Melt our cold hearts, let tears fall like rain. Come change our love from a spark to a flame. Rest for the ravished earth, oceans and streams, plundered and poisoned, our future, our dreams. Lord, and our madness, carelessness, greed, make us content with the things that we need. God of the poor, friend of the weak, give us compassion, we pray. Melt our cold hearts, let tears fall like rain. Come change our love from a spark to a flame. Lighten our darkness, breathe on this flame until your justice burns brightly again. Until the nations learn of your ways, seek your salvation and bring you their praise. God of the poor, friend of the weak, give us compassion, we pray. Melt our cold hearts, let tears fall like rain. Come change our love from a spark to a flame. God of the poor, friend of the weak, give us compassion, we pray. Melt our cold hearts, let tears fall like rain. Come change our love from a spark to a flame.
Okay, amen. So let's continue to think, no, and think to the suffering of the people around us. Uh, Not really to depress us, although sometimes it's depressing, but to also make us more aware about how we live our lives, no? Um, see, I forgot his name, no? One of the statesmen in the Philippines said in one of his reflections that one way by which he tries to temper his natural greed, no? Because there's really a natural greed in each of us, is to always think, no, about the suffering of others. And I think this is where what Tim was saying last week, no, is very important. That it's good to be able to also walk the ground, the same ground that people who are suffering walks through, no, because that helps us reflect on how we live our lives. No? It doesn't mean, of course, that comfort is bad. No, in fact, comfort, wellness is Wellness is the aim, no? In the Old Testament, that's really the aim. That's what we're looking for, no? The wellness of people. Uh, but it would be good to be well when others are well as well, to have that shared wellness, no? And while we are not at that stage yet, it would always be good to be aware, no, that while we enjoy a sense of comfort, uh, that there are people who might actually be suffering no, because of little things that we do, like what we do to the environment, no. uh, the Western countries, no, the more affluent countries, they might think that they're not doing anything, no, they're morally upright, no, but small things like not disposing your garbage correctly, or abusing. There are things now that we do that we cannot live without, which abuses nature, and that has an impact to the poorer. So we are actually all responsible. No, I just asked Chris the title of the book. It's Judith Butler. No, I'm gonna type her name here, and the title of the book is Precarious Lives. If you want to take a look at that. It's a book on philosophy, very modern philosophy, but it also touches on a theme that is very much present in the legal materials. So when I read that, I thought, oh, this is very nice. No, that underscores the wisdom that is in the Bible, because the Bible thought about it already, and that's the reason why in the legal materials, you've gone through the ano no, you've gone through the book of the covenant. You can already see there some of the verses that talk about the marginalized and how the community should take care of them. No, we will see more of that as we go through some of the books. Okay, so if you're interested to have a look at that book, you can do so. It's good to be able to engage these modern philosophies and see how they echo or give probably a more modern nuance of what the Bible is already talking about. Even if Judith Butler is not a Christian, she's not a Christian. Okay, she's not a believer. But you can see there the shared wisdom, no, that is present in people or in humanity in general. Okay, before we go through to the reporting, by the way, in terms of the requirement, I'm sorry, no, I should have set the Moodle so that only even if one in the group will submit, that should be sufficient, no. In fact, if one in your group has submitted, the others do not need to submit. But there's a setting in Moodle wherein it will only require one submission from the group. I've been trying to determine it, and then when I figured it out, you've already submitted, so I could not change the settings anymore. But for the succeeding group work, I will do that again. I will make sure that only one of you need to submit, and that should be the submission for the group, at least for the group work. And before I go to the slide that I wanted to share, may I just invite you to a consultation and a sort of a debriefing as well, and a conversation that is going to happen on Friday at 7 to 9. This is related to the TU Forum. No? So the first half of the TU Forum is finished. And we want to hear from the public, although there's been comments already during each episode itself, no. But it would be good to think together as a community and listen to the feedback, regardless of whether you agree with the proposition of the speakers or not. If you don't agree, feel free to do so. No, this will be a very open and non-judgmental space, no, for everybody. This is in fact hosted by the Transfoteo class, not because Chris thought about it. In fact, he was mandated by the faculty to organize this, and because we could not think of a schedule where we can put this, and we know that this is also the concern of transformation theology, the class has decided to host it for us. So I saw the names of Kuya Well and Zim, I think, are part of that class. No, so if you want to join that, please register so that you can get the Zoom link. No, so it will be basically, there will be no presentations. It will be more of a conversation. So you will be broken into small groups. The students will go together, and it will be facilitated not by faculty, so that you will feel free to speak out. Because sometimes, even if we keep saying that feel free to speak out, no, it seems that that does not necessarily happen. Only very few are actually, brave enough to speak out their mind, especially if they disagree with the teacher. You should really, I know, you should really learn to do that, no, because even in the level of faculty, we disagree with each other. Chris and I disagree with each other. We don't necessarily, we are not always aligned in terms of our theological stand. Um, and we are okay with that. We are all trained in the academe. That is the reality of the academe. No? And we know that our position might change anyway. And that's why it's really no big deal if you disagree with each other. But in order to facilitate, to facilitate probably a better space so that you will feel freer to actually share. The student groups will be facilitated by students. This will be open to the public because we want to hear from the community as well. It's good to engage the community and hear what they are saying, but they have their own breakout groups. So if you want to join, the registration link is in the Capeteo page. I will try to share it in the comment in the chat box later on. But that's happening tomorrow at 7 to 9. No, we will aim to finish at 9. I'm not the primary, well, this is really a project of the faculty. No, I'm just helping organize it. And I think it's always good to consult as a community. Theologizing is not just the work of those who are trained to do it. It's the community that negotiates this. No, we always have to listen to what the community is saying. So uh, please feel free to join. No, especially because we also will be thinking through how do we apply this. No, what would be practical ways by which we actually can uh, achieve uh, bearing truth, no, especially in our ministry. And we Bible readers are always talking about truth, no. The truth will set us free. That is very biblical, and truth is being challenged now, no, in the present age, because of how facts or how information is being disseminated out there, no, the easy access to information, so that truth can, be very, very contentious. Uh, but I think there are certain categories by which we can come to certain truth, no? And uh, well, those who have been my student, you know very well that in terms of exegesis, I'm not an advocate for there is a single interpretation to one text, and that should be the only correct interpretation. No, there are many ways that you can approach the text, and given certain boundaries, of course, it's not also open for everybody. No, given certain boundaries, you might actually get 5 different kind of truth, and they're all good truths. Okay, and they will all benefit the community, and edify each other, and glorify the Lord as well. So please join us. Can you also try to share this to your church mates and to your friends, so that we can have more outside people outside of our community that will help us think through, because sometimes we're all from ATS, no, we're using the same methodology, so there's also a tendency for us to think uh, along a certain direction, even if there are diversions, no, but normally the diversions are very minimal. So it would be good if we can listen to outside perspective as well. So if you can invite your friends, your church mates, and those who are interested at thinking through issues in the world, they are very welcome to attend. This will, however, be a closed session. No? It's not going to be live streamed. Okay. In fact, we're hoping that ATS can come up with a position paper after the consultations. There will be 2 consultations. Okay. And then let me share Any question regarding that? Wala naman. Sige. There's a few slides that I wasn't able to tackle during the first two sessions that we did the asynchronous, and I feel that this is very important because I want to remind you and to always have that in mind when you are dealing with a biblical text. No, one of your readings talk about the Bible, the Torah as an ancient text. No, but it's very easy to forget that. I I'm my fellowship in college. There's a big conversation right now, no, between people who uh, I think are not conscious that the way they look at scripture is very literal, no. So we have two contending groups in that fellowship. Some of one group is talking about context. Another group is talking about, well, this is what the Bible said. The Bible said that women should submit and that's it. Or the Bible said no, the, the Bible said this command, so that's it. No, um, and they cannot agree because definitely they come from two different hermeneutical perspective. No, one of them looks at the book as very literal because it's God's word, so it should transcend time. What He said before should apply to us now. No, but we know very well responsible hermeneutics should know very well that it's not as straightforward as that, uh, especially given the nature of the text. No? And that's why it's very important to actually go through Theology 1 because somehow that reframes the way you look at the text. So I want to go through this again. And hopefully this, if you read I think it's the Oxford, it's been a while since I reviewed those materials, no? But I think it's the Oxford article on the legal material. No? It just went through like a summary, of what you have there. But it's talking about how do we look at these texts as ancient texts. No? So remember I was talking about different meanings of history. No? And for our case, how do we deal with the law as genre? Okay. So we said that we have to be very conscious of, before we even talk about history, we have to be very conscious of how we define it, because for all we know, we might be coming from different baseline in terms of definition. Okay, so there's historical background, the background of the text itself, the background that may have produced the text, historiography. Historiography is trying to reconstruct history based on the biblical text. No? And sometimes that can actually, it's not just sometimes, no? In many points, that may go against what is reconstructed by historians. No? And that should spur us into thinking, no, what kind of history did the biblical writers conceive? Is it the same kind? Did they have the same kind of definition of history as we have now? And we keep saying in biblical studies that that's not the case. And I gave you examples from my own experience as a member of a community wherein the oral tradition is still very strong. No? And that somehow parallels the oral tradition of the cultures that produce the Bible, no? And there's also the historical process, the process by which the books that we have now emerge. No, it's so funny in the conversation in my fellowship. I think so many people are not even aware, and there's just, I think they know it, no, but when they deal with the Bible, that does not factor in with the way they deal with the Bible, so that the Bible is treated like a flat literature, no. They always say that there's a process by which the Bible came to be what it is now, but that's not considered when you're exegeting, and that can be very dangerous. No, that can be very dangerous. Um, Now, if we were to show a very simplified, and this might be oversimplifying it too much, but at least just to have a broad picture of what happened, no? in terms of the Old Testament. So the movement of the Old Testament text, um, although there are similarities with the movement of the New Testament text, that the trajectory is also different. You have to remember that the New Testament happened so many years later. No, the New Testament was produced well around first century, second century, up to the fourth century. No, so around those times, not up to the fourth century, up to second, third century. No, CE. Okay, whereas in the Old Testament, that's prior to Christ. So the trajectory of movement of the production of the Old Testament is slightly different. No? It did not follow the same path. But largely, the Old Testament was initially oral. No, not Old Testament. I'm not the book itself. No, so there was no one book and it was all oral. No, it was more um, of uh, separate materials that were transmitted within the community. So, for example, maybe the story of Deborah was being transmitted orally, no, as a story within the community. So we had separate smaller chunks of material that were transmitted orally. Okay, and then there's the writing portion, no, wherein this smaller chunks of material were textualized. And then there's the editing. Okay, there's the editing time, no? And this can be very, very contentious. In fact, one of the pastors in my fellowship was so angry with me when I said that, the finalization of the Pentateuch happened during the exile. He was so angry. And I said there's very strong internal and external evidence to support that. And he said, but the Bible says itself that Moses wrote it. I said, that traditional perspective is also a theory, because he was accusing me of peddling a false theory there. So when I said, your claim is also a theory, he got very angry. He doesn't want to hear that that's also a theory. So in fact, when I started giving him some proof that are not language related, not Hebrew related, just so he can see what the problem is when he starts peddling that, just by quoting some verses that goes against his. He was really so angry, he was fuming mad, and he actually started attacking scholarship. How scholarship actually does not support faith and things like that. So there's a lot of attack that happened there against me. Anyway, so there's that editing time, no? The time when these materials were collected together intentionally. This stage, no, is a very, very interesting stage for me. I haven't really gone into this in depth. I know it in broad strokes, no. But there are people who actually study ideological criticism. What was the ideology that went into the collection? Why were they conscious about collecting this text, no? After the fact, no? Why at a certain point of history they wanted to actually put this text together? That's the editing part, no? And of course, later on, it was finalized. And when it was finalized, when I say finalization, I'm not really saying the final Old Testament text. That's a different, the final entire Old Testament. It's possible that Genesis was finalized first, no? So even the finalization of the material also came in chunks, okay? So finalization, for example, of the first part of Isaiah, or the finalization of let's say the Deuteronomistic material. No? Those of you who were in narrative, we've looked at these different corpuses, no, that scholars are saying were finalized together. No, there's a main editor that finalized them together, and of course, after the final form, you would have the final Old Testament text. But even this is contentious, because you have to remember that for the Jewish community, for them, there are also hierarchy in terms of authority. So within the Jewish community, even prior to Christ, there's an order. No? So the Torah for them is more important, for example, than the other books. No? So theologically, they perceive certain chunks of material as more authoritative. No? Uh, whether authoritative in terms of a certain perspective, like maybe how you live your life. No, that's something else that needs to be explored as well. Okay, and then after the final form, and you also have to remember, that when we talk about the final form, it's so hard to pinpoint, which final form it is, because you have to remember that these were already being circulated within the community, and that's why you have different manuscripts. So we have the Samaritan Pentateuch, for example, as a representative manuscript of the Pentateuch, which is slightly different from the Masoretic text of the Pentateuch. So this, even if they were already finalized, because they were already being transmitted by different communities. And you have to remember there were no printing press at this time. Everything was handwritten. Um, so there were differences within these manuscripts as well, no? So even the final form, the finalization of it, is not as straightforward as we want it to be, primarily because the transmission of the text happened within history itself. Okay, now after that is of course the transmission. No? Transmission meaning at certain junctures in time, if you look at the history, the history of God's people, Israel, there came a point when part of the transmission already involved translation. No, because after the exile, they started being in diaspora. They were uh, they were forced to go to different areas within Asia and Europe, so that the Jews lived in diaspora. Okay, and eventually they started losing the language. No, so there's also the evolution of language, and you can actually see in the biblical text itself. The biblical text itself is a very clear witness to that. No, the evolution of the language, so that they started to lose the original Greek, original Hebrew, the older Hebrew syntax and grammar, no? So that when you go to Ecclesiastes, the grammar of Hebrew there is a little bit different, which tells you that it's really a later book, probably not Solomonic, no, because the probably not in the time of the monarchy, no, because the grammar is so different. It's so closer to after the Persian Empire. So the the finalization of that book happened later, no? And then there are also books that had Aramaic already. So you can see that the grammar itself within the biblical, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is not uniform. No, it's not uniform. And then after that, when they uh, lost the language, lost meaning the larger part of the community cannot read it anymore, cannot read the Hebrew Bible anymore, no? Especially during the time of the Greek Empire. No? uh, so they also had to translate that into Greek, and so we had the Septuagint or the LXX. So even translation, so translation is not just a phenomenon that happens now. No, it's something that happened long time ago. So that most likely during the time of Jesus, the Bible, the Old Testament Bible that they have, would most like, especially the larger community, would most likely be a translation rather than the original Hebrew Bible. So even the translation is part of the transmission of the Bible. And so we should not look down on translations, because that's part of the propagation of the Bible. No, I often hear people say, well, if you want to learn the original, go to Greek and Hebrew, and that's a very worthy endeavor. I think, no? It's good to have that, because you can go back to the primary sources, no, but it does not mean that you don't have access to the Hebrew Bible if you are only relying on translation. No? Because even early on, no, most likely during the community of Paul, the Bible that they had was a Greek one. The Old Testament is a Greek Bible rather than a Hebrew Bible. No, so Dr. Professor Muraoka, no, one of the leading critics of the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint. When he came here at ATS, we were very fortunate to listen to him. No, he came here twice. I jokingly said, so when the New Testament says that all scriptures are inspired, most likely he was really referring to the Greek Old Testament, right? And he was laughing, no, because there's really a reality to that. You have to remember when that verse was written, you did not have yet the New Testament, right? And most likely what they had was the Old Testament text, no, in different forms. Of course, the scribes and the Pharisees can read Hebrew, but the larger faith community, those who go to the synagogues, no, would be reading the Greek Bible rather than the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so we have to be very, very conscious of this when we are dealing with an ancient text, so that when we exegete, we have that in mind all the time. And we are very conscious that in terms of meaning, there are also layers of meaning in it. Okay? Because the Bible, so even in ancient time, they already treated this as God's word, no, divine word. Even in ancient time, no, even during the time when it was still oral. Okay, because you have to remember that the worldview of the Old Testament, there is no demarcation between sacred and secular to begin with. So when they engage in politics, that's part of the whole system of norms. No, God was involved with that. Okay, so when you talk about the prophets, even if it was not yet the entire Hebrew Bible, no, even if it was still during the stage when these were separate chunks of material, it was already considered as the word of the divine, the word of uh, the deity, no, in more technical term. So it already had that state. Okay, so when we deal with the Old Testament and even the New Testament, no, we have to keep that in mind, that there are layers of meaning, which means that even when they were just dealing with separate materials, not the entire Hebrew Bible, this already meant something for them. No, it was already meaningful for them. Okay, and that's the reason why when we talk about meaning, we in the scholarly world would be saying, where are you pegging the meaning? No, when they say the author's intention, we would normally say, which author? No, which stage in history are you really talking about? No, because this meant something to the communities that engage with the text. Okay, unless of course you believe, no, and this is not a of course you are free to believe this, no, you believe that the entire Pentateuch was written by Moses, then that's a different story altogether, no. But if you do so, I would really encourage you to look at the evidence as well. No? How would you explain both the internal and the external evidences within the text itself? No, not just the what we call this. I think theology is very would really say disagreements. They would use that term, no. It can be disagreements, I would say, no, but sometimes it's not necessarily a disagreement, no. But also not just the text itself, not just the content, no, but the grammar of the text, the syntax of the text, no. So those internal evidences that are there, you have to be able to account for them when you take a position in terms of how the Bible or the Hebrew Bible was produced, no. So I want us to be very, very conscious of the reality behind the text as we approach the interpretation of it. Now, there are several methods, a lot of methods in biblical studies, no, and you can group them in several movements, no. One of the more classic methodology would be the historical critical methodology. Okay, and I think some of your readings have already been talking about this methodology. So, for example, part of the historical critical methodology would be source criticism. You're looking at the sources. Now, where did these smaller chunks of material come from? Whether they were transmitted orally or whether they were already textualized. Okay, uh, who produced them? No? Which communities produced them? The reduction criticism also looks at who edited the entire material. No? Why put it together? Now, what is the theological purpose for putting them together? Because that's part of the historical process. Okay. There's also form criticism, which looks at the oral patterns. No, so it looks at the different oral patterns in poetry, for example, and you can categorize them into different forms. No, so even lament is quite um, a big collection. There are smaller different forms within the lament, no? Or judgment oracles. There are smaller different forms. In the legal material, we also have different forms of legal material. And that's the reason why when you look at the legal material in Leviticus, it seems to have a different flavor to it compared form-wise, no? Compared with what we see, for example, in Exodus. Okay, so you look at those forms and patterns. Okay, and what social setting actually allowed for this form to proliferate. Okay, sometimes form is interchangeably used by scholars with genre. Okay, so for example, it's like music. No? You know that within history there were different genres of music that came about. No, and sometimes you can in fact identify yourself by your taste of the genre of music. Although that's not a foolproof way of identifying your generation, no? Because I know that there are younger generation who actually love the more classic genres of music. No, but it's similar. No? If you look at the biblical material, you can identify forms and genre as well, even within the bigger chunks of genre. Okay, so the biggest chunks would be narratives. Okay, so the narratives in Genesis, for example, would be different from the narratives, let's say, in Ezra, Nehemiah. And precisely because Ezra and Nehemiah was produced after the Persian Empire. Now, this was the time when they were already wanting to go back to Israel. So it's a different generation altogether. And you can expect that because the historical period is different, most likely the people who were helping, no, in the production of this material also had, different tastes in terms of form. Okay, even within the legal material, you can identify. So you have narratives, you have the legal material. In the legal material, you have different forms as well within this bigger genre. And then we have poetry. Okay, and within poetry, you have different forms as well. Now, there's also what we call tradition history, and this deals with how tradition was passed and reinterpreted in the whole process. Remember, I said that for us to actually have the whole Bible, it took a long process. But the Bible did not gain its status as divine word, no, only when it was complete. No, it was even before that. So tradition history looks at that tradition, no, before, even prior to the time when it was put together, okay, as an entire book. Normally in systematic theology, when they talk about when did it attain its divinity, they would go back to, the, what do you call this, the authorizing bodies, no, that gave the book its divinity. But it's not really like that. No, we know from evidence that even prior to the entire book itself, it already had that status within the community that produced them. Okay, so when Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, was recognized as a legitimate prophetic material, even before it was included in the Hebrew Bible, it already had that status of divinity, no, that it came from the divine. So tradition history deals with that. No, looks at how tradition was passed on and how it was interpreted during those times. Okay. Now we also have textual criticism. I mentioned earlier, this is one of my favorite. I teach this in ATS because this is very interesting for me. It's very, very forensic. It's really it's like looking at manuscript evidence. So when I deal with this, it excites me a lot. Remember I said earlier that these materials were initially oral, and then they were textualized, but written, not printed. No, when they were being copied, Imagine, no, you're talking about a big community, Israel, for example, and there were communities that the text was being transmitted in different communities. We have evidence that this part of this transmission, there were errors in transmission. No, there were copying errors. Maybe the scribes that were copying were very sleepy, and so the scribe, after copying the last clause, would have jumped to another. You know, when you're copying a book, no, and you actually encounter one word, and then your eye jumps into the same word but in a different part. No, so that's one of those differences in this manuscript. So we have manuscript evidence, no, from way before, showing us that there were issues, no, in the transmission process. So textual criticism tries to deal with this. No, it's one of the methodologies in biblical studies that is very scientific, no, in approach. It tries to recover, it tries to go back to the earliest possible that it can go back to. No, so unfortunately, there is no such thing as the original. No, we don't have the original is just a what do you call this? Well, theoretically, you can probably say maybe there was an original Isaiah, no? But we don't have copies of that. So what we have now are manuscripts that sometimes may be different from each other. Okay. Now, in the case of the Old Testament, it's not massively different. No, it's not naman massively different so that you can say that, oh, the error is so huge. No. But there are definitely differences that needs to be accounted for. No, so one very interesting phenomenon recently that came about that changed the course of textual criticism. So textual criticism tries to establish the text. Now, what would be the earliest possible form of the text given the manuscript evidence that we have now? Recently, after the Second World War, I think, if I'm not mistaken, there was a find, no, an archaeological find. It was actually started accidentally. No, the find initially was accident. No, so a boy found some jars. No, and they realized that within that area there are so many other jars that contain manuscripts. No, these are the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there was an excavation, and they found, no, libraries of material. Now, the library of material does not just contain the Hebrew Bible. It's a library, so it contains other books as well. So you actually the Dead Sea Scroll material, you actually don't know whether the other books were considered as divine by the community as well. No, it doesn't tell us that, okay? Because it's a collection of so many books, but among those collection would be the manuscripts of what we now have as the Old Testament. And this is just recently a recent find, no, 20th century find, but the dating of the material that we have there, at least for the Hebrew Bible, is 2nd century BC. Which is quite old. No? So these are very old materials. So now, one of the work of textual critics, no, when you're establishing the text, is to actually compare the Dead Sea Scroll with the Masoretic text that we have now. No, the Masoretic text, which is the basis of our Old Testament, have slight differences with the older form, the one that they found in the Dead Sea Scroll, in the Qumran cave, no, in the Qumran cave. Okay, so isn't that interesting? No, so when Kuya Boy, when Sir Boy and Chris would talk about, issues within the content of the text, the issues are not just in the content. No, there are also issues in terms of manuscript, no, the external evidence that we have. Those are the things that they don't deal with in theology, but that's a reality that we have to contend with. So these are samples of historical critical methods. No, it looks at transmission within history and what happens during that time. Now, we will deal a little bit with this as we go through the legal materials, but because we are we are not training you to be experts on this, we will have to rely on what scholars are saying with regard to these methodologies. No, and of course they don't always agree. So you also have to weigh the evidences that they present. No, so for example, most critical scholars now would agree that the Pentateuch have sources, no? The JEPD. No, but in terms of identification, there would be variations in terms of identifications. No, so it's not always as neat and as straightforward as well when it comes to scholarly opinion. So you will have to weigh, which one is presenting probably the best evidence. Sometimes the evidence would also be, almost equal. So you will just have to choose. No, but that's the reality of the matter. No, so we will deal a little bit with this because we have to. No, but more than anything, we will be looking at the final form of the text. So we will be dealing with the final form, meaning the text as we have it now. So we will be reading it as a literature. Now, the pastor in my group chat was saying that's the problem with you scholars because you only deal with scripture as literature. You don't deal with it as God's word. And I told him, well, God's word came to us as literature, so we have to respect that, no? And I asked him, okay, give me the hermeneutical process. If you were to treat it as God's word, explain to me the hermeneutical process. Now, when he tried explaining it to me, the way it sounded is that you take it literally. No, if it says you stone an adulterer, you stone an adulterer. No, and I told him there's an issue with that. There's an issue with that perspective because you don't actually do many things that the Bible tell you. No, so why do you not do it? There's an inconsistency in how you apply the hermeneutics as well. Okay, but of course we did not have enough time to discuss, and it's very unfortunate because he was already so angry at me. So the anger was the one that was fueling the discussion. He was just attacking me as a very heretic scholar right in front of my friends. Okay, now we will deal with the final form of it, and one of the methods that will predominate the way we will look at it would be rhetorical criticism. No, this is what you actually learn in hermeneutics. It may not have been named as that, no, but when you look at rhetoric, no, how sentences are organized so that they come out as effective conversation, no, how the sentences are stringed together, the words that are very prominent, the repetition, those are part of what we call rhetorical criticism. No, you study the rhetoric, how it is being said, okay, and from that you try to ascertain meaning, okay, that you can get from it. Of course, we will not deal with it as it is, no. We also need historical critical methods because we have to peg it within a historical time frame. Otherwise, we will be reading it as a modern literature, right? So, for example, when it says this, the punishment of this infraction is death, we might actually be, if we are not very conscious of how historically the text is bound, no, we might be using our own modern thinking of, let's say, the death penalty and imposing that into the text. Whereas it's possible that when they talk about the capital punishment, it's a different dynamics altogether from what we have in the modern world, no? So we look at the wordings, we look at the rhetoric, no? So this is classified as literary criticism, and that's what we will use predominantly. But we will not do away with historical critical methodologies because it's important for us to be aware of the cultural background. No, why was it important for them to have slaves? No, it's so easy to just do away or neglect the text that talks about slavery, no? Because our modern sensibilities does not allow that, right? It's just immoral for us. Even if at certain points of history, these passages were actually used to justify slavery, no? But for most modern people, that is not acceptable. Okay. Now, it's very important for us to, and we will do that the next time we meet. No, we will look at one of the slavery texts, no, and what it meant for them. What insights can we learn from it? Even if in modern day time, we can disagree that we can agree that slavery is not good, no. But what ethics can we get from that? And that's the more important thing, I think. Okay, so we will narrative criticism for the narrative part. So those of you who actually had experiences doing narrative criticism during the time of Dr. Athena, if she was your teacher, and last sem, if I was your teacher, you can use this to read the narratives, no? But for the exegetical paper, I will be zeroing in on the legal material, the exact legal material, not the narrative part. Okay, so predominantly we will be using literary criticism, and for our purposes, most likely rhetorical criticism. Okay. Okay. Now, what's the difference? I already implied this a little bit while I was discussing through the methodologies. With this, the reading the law as literature, no, means that we focus on the final form of the text. Okay, we focus on the final form of the text. In fact, a very literal reading of the Bible focuses on the final form, di ba? Because you don't care at all whatever background it has, no? So you're really just looking at the final form, no? Now, for our case, we deal with the final form. So we mix, no? We mix the two. I think that's the healthier way of doing it. We mix the two so that we deal with the final form, but we are very, very conscious with the culture, the background that gives backdrop to this material. Okay, rhetorical criticism also looks at the text as a unity. No, we don't chop it like you do in Theology 1, especially if Kuya Boy is your teacher. Okay, we don't chop it. I'm not saying that his methodology is wrong. It has its use. No, it's being used in this one, source criticism. Okay, and it's part of recovering, no, the history behind the text. But in our case, you also have to remember that when there was an editor, no, when there was an editor who put it together, there was also intentionality to it, no, so that the broken sources, when it was put together, uh, the editor has an intention for it, no, it has a very nice flow to it, so that you can actually consider it as a whole rather than as a divided material, no. So we look at the text as unity rather than just zeroing in on which one is priestly, which one is Yahwist, which one is Elohist. No, we look at it as a whole, no, and see what we can gain, what insights we can gain from looking at it from the whole perspective. Okay, and this is okay given the historical process because the editor was there who put it together as a whole. Um, the rhetorical criticism also views the text as an end in itself rather than as a means to an end. Okay, and the goal is to understand the rhetoric, what it is trying to say as a final form, rather than the culture that came before it or the history that produced it. Okay, because, well, the reason why we limit it to this methodology is because we don't have access to the methodologies. I mean, there are some of you here, those who are in the biblical studies department, who will eventually have the skills to go back to the historical critical method, no? But for as long as we don't have that, we can contend with looking at the meaning of the final text, and that's okay. No, that's not necessarily bad. Okay, for as long as we don't do just a literal reading. We're very conscious that there's a culture that produces it. There's a sociological context that is at stake there. No, so when we talk about sacrifices, for example, what is the sociological context, no, that is there? Okay, so we try to mix the two, but when we look at the historical critical aspect of it, we will have to rely on scholarly material. Okay. Oh, it stopped sharing. Okay. So before we go to the group sharing, any question about this at all? Any concerns that you want to raise regarding this process? Maybe some of you are already, very, very aware of this, but it's good to look at it again because it's so easy to forget about this when you are already trying to ascertain meaning. No, I've seen it so many times. It took a while for me to actually really internalize this before it became part of my system. In fact, it was only when I went to my PhD that it became part of my system. It became second nature that I always have to think about this. No, more often than not, prior to PhD, I would also fall into the trap of proof texting, no, because that's very easy to do. And that's the system that we are so accustomed to doing. And so we should not we should not always we should not always be, very, very critical of those who are doing proof texting, because it's so easy to fall into that. Actually, no, it takes so much discipline and internalization and so much consciousness to always be aware, no, of the nature of the text as you interpret the text itself. So any question at all that you want to bring up, even if it's not related to the legal material, but maybe the process of the production of the Hebrew Bible? Nothing? That did not bother you at all? Or maybe you already have settled it with your Theology 1 professor, no? It's really the job of Theology 1 to settle. Because when you talk about this now in matters of faith and theology, no, how does this affect your articulation of your theology of the Bible? That's the work of Theology 1. No, in our case, in biblical studies, we just describe what it is. No, this is what it is. This is the nature of the text. Okay, the faith part of it is more of a theological aspect. Yes, Tim, are you trying to say something? I cannot hear you. Can you hear Tim? Can you try again, Tim? Nawala na si Tim. What about the others while we wait for Tim? Any questions? Have you all done Theology 1? Can I get a thumbs up, those who've done Theology 1? Oh, wow. Okay. So a lot of you, know. Okay. Okay. That's good then. So this is a non-issue. This is more of a reminder, no? This is more of a reminder of what the text is. Because I remember myself when I was an MDiv student, and even if I actually had Theology 1, even if I had Theology 1, and somehow I told myself, I'm settled already. I'm okay. I'm able to articulate my theology of the Bible. But when I went to my senior year and we were doing textual criticism, so we were looking at a different manuscript. So I knew that there were discrepancies, no, but handling the manuscript myself, I was like, what does this do to my faith? No, what does this, how will I articulate my? So at each point of my stay here at ATS, I always have to back off, no, and recalibrate myself and try to find a way to articulate again. No, how do I reframe now? Especially because I still want to be part of the faith community. No, I don't want this to be just a descriptive work. Uh, I want to be able to minister to people, because really this can be just a descriptive work, no? And that's the reason why there are very good scholars of the Bible who are non-believers. And we're not dismissing their work because they do very good work. They just describe it, no? And it's up to us, of course, to use it for our purposes, for the purpose of faith, no? But when I was in ATS, I remember certain times of certain junctures of my stay here where I had to, think through again. Okay, and one of those major ones was when I was already a student of textual criticism. I was the single student, by the way. I was the only one who wanted to do that. And we had one professor, Dr. Russ Stapleton, who is an expert in ancient Near East and the Semitic languages. So he taught that. And I was dealing with different texts, no, the Old Testament, different Hebrew texts. So we were looking at differences between these manuscripts, and I thought, oh, I had to go back again and read my theology one book. How do I account for this? How do I explain this now? If I were to articulate it as part of my, my faith articulation. Okay, team, you're here. Can we try again? Yeah, there. I can
Yeah.
hear the
Do
sound.
you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I guess one question I just have is if we're going to focus on literary criticism, how might we address concerns, even what you were alluding to earlier with the pastor who says that Moses wrote the Pentateuch? How might how might a response that's purely based on literary criticism respond to um, arguments or thoughts like that?
Can you give an example so that I have something to work with?
Yeah, so I mean, I can't remember the specific passage off the top of my head, but when in the passages that say Moses wrote this, or yeah, this was written by Moses, how might a literary
okay.
criticism approach? Yeah.
Yeah, normally in literary criticism, you don't even deal with authors anymore, right? Because you're just approaching it from the perspective of the text. So, of course, you're aware of the issues of authorship at the back of your mind. And that can be very important in terms of pegging the material. So, for example, if I know that a certain, for example, the practices of sacrifices, for example, no? Because Moses is so old, di ba? So that's a so if I most of the time, if you don't need elements from the historical material, if there are no elements that might, if there are no historical critical elements in the text itself that might confuse you as you exegete the passage from from a literary perspective, you don't actually need to go back to even authorship, no. But there are certain cases, so it's also an even the evenness of historical consciousness as you approach the literary material is not the same all throughout. Now sometimes there are materials wherein, for example, the Ten Commandments, for example, I can just deal with the Ten Commandments and look at the rhetoric of it and not necessarily deal with the fact that Moses wrote this, no, because I can still get a significant meaning by studying it rhetorically. Okay, of course, it will be another layer if I will ask myself, okay, if I believe that the Ten Commandments was actually eventually put together. So it's what I'm saying is, in the historical critical process, it does not also necessarily say that Moses was uninvolved, for example. Okay, so it's possible that the tradition really goes back to Moses, no? But when it was put together along with the other parts of the Pentateuch, it had a different meaning altogether because it was used in the exile. So when I want to enrich, so when I want to add another layer to my literary criticism, and I would say, this is my literary analysis. But if I put this within the context of the exile, how will that change, for example, the meaning of the Ten Commandments? So there are layers to it, so that there are layers to meaning making in exegesis, so that even if we're just dealing with it from a literary perspective, you can already get a lot of meaning. When you peg it to a different, when you peg it to a certain historical timeline or a historical milieu, of course, the meaning can be even richer, right? So for example, just reading the creation story, will just reading it literally, no, not literally, from a literature perspective. If you look at the Genesis creation material, one of the things that you can get from that is that there's a lot of order, no, there's consciousness of order. That's something that you can get from it. You can, and just you're just dealing with it from the perspective of literature, no, as a literary critic. you can also understand that that creation did not just end in creation, no? That the intention of creation is not just in the garden, but there is an assumption that there will be development of structures, no? And in terms of theology, what that will tell you is that this opens up the possibility that part of the created order is actually the structures that we have now: government, uh, politics, your work, for example. No, that's part of that. So you can get that from a literary critical perspective. Now, when you now peg it to a certain historical period, especially if you're talking about authorship, and you think of the creation story as being finalized in the exile, it does not drastically change the meaning. You can still use the insights that you got from a literary perspective, but there might be reframing in terms of, wow, this was very important for them during the time when they lost the land. No, and it was very important for them to actually think of where did we come from. No, it's part of their remembering. So there's another layer of meaning, and so the meaning becomes richer. Now, if you look at it from the perspective of tradition history, remember tradition history looks at the communities that were involved in the transmission from oral to written and to the final text. Okay, of course, many of this will be theoretical. This will be very, very difficult, no? And even scholars will disagree about, what the process that it went through. And that's the reason why normally meaning making is not done within those periods, because it's very, very contentious. No, you don't know exactly, like when you peg it within the Mosaic time, how will you understand that? No? How will you exactly understand that? When you look at it from the perspective of the different chunks of material, as it went through the oral and then the written part, where exactly? Which part exactly? Okay, so normally when you look at it from a combination of literary and historical critical, if it's from a combination, you try to determine what part of history are you talking about. No, now when you are just dealing with literary criticism and you're sharing this with somebody, usually you don't go into authorship anymore, and normally I avoid doing so because it's so difficult to explain, no? Especially if the person does not have enough background in biblical studies, and you end up in the kind of argument that I got myself in, no? Because this pastor read well. He's very well read. I will give that to him, no? But I think not enough to really understand the debate within the scholarly world, so that he ended up accusing the entire scholarly world as being anti-Christian, no? And in fact, he categorically mentioned that. No, he warned everybody. He started saying, "Be wary of scholars who destroy the faith, no, and peddle interpretations of the Bible that goes against the teaching of the church." So when I said, "Which church are you talking about?" Like which one? Your church, your interpretation? And he started saying, because I wanted to show him that, scripture cannot stand on its own. It's always subject to interpretation. And even within interpretation history, it varied, no? If you look at the church fathers, they have a different understanding. The Reformation had a different understanding from the church fathers. So he started going back to the Nicene Creed, for example. And I said, that's also interpretation, no? So, and I was trying to point out that tradition should not be the final authority on matters of faith, no? Because obviously there are newer evidences that are coming up. For example, the Dead Sea Scroll is just a recent find, no? Some of the best manuscripts that are coming out are just very recent addition to the collection of witnesses to scripture that we have. No, but I was also very offended, in fact, because he started accusing me of being a heretic and started excluding me from the group. No, he was warning everybody about me right in front of my face. So I said, "Am I not part of the church when you say the church should be the authority, I'm not part of the church. And then when I ask him, which church are you talking about? Actually, what he means is his interpretation, di ba? His interpretation is something that he, because if I disagree with him, he keeps going back to, you scholars do not support the teachings of Bible-believing pastors. And I said, even you Bible-believing pastors do not even agree with each other. So how can you accuse us of something, of being heretics? No, in fact, what I can be very proud of scholarship is there is a very accepted methodology, no, and you are checked by other scholars for what you do. And in fact, when we speak, we say, I think the meaning of this is, instead of saying scripture says that. Did you see the difference? No, it's usually the ones who are not very aware of methodologies that are more arrogant in terms of their claims. But anyway, I'm digressing. When you're talking about, in fact, literary criticism would be the safest. No, for as long as you do it responsibly, it would be the safest method that you can employ. For example, in when you're preaching in the church and your audience is not well versed, for example, with the debates in terms of sources. No, you can use that. I've heard, however, Chris and Sir Boy every now and then peg the material to a certain historical period and preach, no, from that. I don't know if the audience are catching what they're trying to do, but I've seen them do that, and I've seen some other pastors do it as well, especially those who are who have the skill to actually do it. Okay, how do you determine the implied reader if authorship is not a priority for literary criticism? Well, you determine the implied reader from the text. For example, when we talk about Leviticus, and this is in fact what made so actually, Isaac, we should distinguish between the actual reader, the first readers, and like I'm saying, because it's a process, there were so many readers along the way, no, different historical junctures of the production. There were different community of readers, no. The implied reader, however, is different, no. In fact, in literary criticism, this is where we use the sense of an implied reader. You get it from evidence from the text. So for example, when we talk about Leviticus, the implied reader there is somebody who can understand those sacrifices and offerings, no. It's that implied reader knows those, no. So the implied reader is somebody who probably goes to the sanctuary, who attends to this, no. The implied reader is part of that community. So you get it from evidences from the text. Okay. Now in narratives, for example, I forgot the example of that. What text again was that, Isaac? Where we were talking about levirate marriage. Do you remember the text that we were dealing with? The story wherein there was a levirate marriage. There's a lot of stories, but
Was it the Tamar?
yeah, the Tamar, no. So Tamar, from the elements, if you study it from a literary perspective, you can see that there's a concept of levirate marriage in that text, and so your implied reader is somebody who is aware of that. You don't need to explain to him. Okay, so that's your implied reader. So you get it from the text. And this one, this is the materials in Leviticus, for example, for a long time was very difficult to understand for us modern readers, because it is already assuming that the one who reads it knows what is going on. When you read the text of Leviticus, so there are passages there that talks about like meeting in the worship place, no, but it doesn't describe exactly what whoever is leading the worship is saying. No, we don't get a sense of that. It just tells you the regulations. So it's very incomplete in that sense, no, and we don't get that. And for a while, it's so difficult to deal with the book of Leviticus until the work of anthropologists came in, no? And it looked at living cultures that does these sacrificial offerings. No, we're not saying that we're going to use modern culture, no, but we're going to look at patterns. No, how does this affect the community? For example, what is the essence of having sacrifices, worshiping in a very structured manner, going through all this ritual? What does that say about the community? And what lessons can we get from that? So your implied read, when you are doing literary criticism, you're actually always aware of your implied reader. The implied reader, you infer from the elements from the text itself. Okay. Of course, the level of inferences would vary from text to text. Right? Sometimes you get a lot of details from one text, but not in another text. And so there would be gaps. And here, sometimes you would have to get the help of, for example, historians of the Bible, no? Those who've done a lot of background work. And this is where the ancient Near Eastern material will become so helpful for us. Uh, Primarily because the material that we are dealing with has a lot of gaps. And so we have to look at uh, evidences outside of the biblical material, but still very close to it in order to have a better sense of what is going on. No? So for example, when we were looking at, you looked at the treatise, right? Comparing the biblical material with ancient treatise, no, will be very, very helpful in terms of allowing us to look at the relationship of God with his people with respect to the law, right? Prior to that, it would be so difficult to have a proper concept of a framework, no? The vaguer it is, no, the vaguer the biblical material is, the more help you need from the ancient Near Eastern material. And that's the reason why every now and then we will be looking at ancient Near Eastern material. In fact, the next lecture that I will be doing is again comparing the laws itself. So the last exercises you did is, what framework do we use? So we looked at the suzerainty framework because it seems that it is the closest framework that we can use for the larger legal corpus. But in terms of the system of laws within, what can we get? How do we understand and appreciate, for example, the slavery culture in the biblical text by putting it alongside ancient Near Eastern material? No, culturally, how are they different? And actually, it will show you that you will appreciate how revolutionary within its own time the biblical text was. No, it might not look very revolutionary for us modern readers, no, because there's slavery. They treat women so badly, no, but within its own historical milieu, the biblical text was doing a lot of subversion already. Okay. And that makes the Bible so amazing, no? These particular people so amazing that they are able to theologically comprehend that. And of course, they explain this as part of their relationship with Yahweh. No, remember, during their time, there was no dichotomy. So whatever they do outside, no, in terms legally, morally, that's part of worship for them. So politics is part of worship. Their notion of what is legal is part of their worship. No, there's no separation, and that is so hard to comprehend. No, personally for me, that's so hard to comprehend because we come from a system wherein there's no, people always saying separation of church and state, things like that. No, but actually, I just wrote an article. It's coming out soon, no, where I made the claim that the Asian culture is actually so much closer to the culture that is portrayed in biblical Israel. No, if you look at the Chinese culture, especially the wisdom of Confucius, ancient China, for example, having their kings as legitimized by the divine. No, there's a lot of parallels there, and political scholars, no, modern political scholarship are actually saying that this is the reason why the Asian culture, when you look at it in terms of politics, although we have adopted so much of the Western notion, it does not it does not really represent the fully Western notion because culturally we're so different from them. And I put there in that paper So I had to study a lot of, Asian culture. I look at so many work by especially Japanese, and cultures that originate from the ancient China, no. Very, very interesting find. Even the wisdom tradition, no, are so similar. So you have the wisdom tradition from the ancient Chinese culture. And I was interacting with some friends from Singapore, and they were commenting about, because I asked them to review, no, maybe I was misinterpreting all that I was reading. So there's a lot of parallel between our culture and the biblical culture, which actually should tell us that we can read the Bible better than Western than Western people, because we can resonate with them. No, the plurality of gods, you have that in Asia, right? That's a reality that we have to contend with in Asia. In fact, the very strict separation between secular and sacred, that's a very, very Western concept rather than Asian. In Asia, there's a lot of overlaps with how we perceive things. And one of the examples that I put there is, this is for the Filipinos. No, you might be interested. If you actually look at Marcos when he was consolidating his power, no, do you know that he commissioned paintings, no, that made them look like their divinity? So there was a time when there were the older ones, the mga ka-age ko, the ano to, Malakas and Maganda, no? And they put those paintings in the story of Malakas and Maganda in Filipino myth is such that the Malakas and Maganda is representative of male and female, and those came from the divine. That's our creation story, our own Filipino creation story. Now, they had a painting commissioned wherein Malakas is the face of Marcos and Maganda is the face of Imelda. And they had these paintings placed in significant places in the country. And in fact, it's reproduced in books during that time. So that when you are actually looking at their faces, no, implicitly you have that notion that, oh, this is divinity. No, you have to remember that Filipino culture is so folklorish. So it's so hard to separate that. The other painting that they commissioned is, I'm not sure if you've seen this. These are the more famous one. Them looking like they are gods. No, they're in the clouds and looking like gods and goddesses. Parang mythological paintings. There's a lot of this, no. And you might think that this is just. You might think, no, that this is just aggrandizement. You might think that this is just, they're delusional, no. But actually, in one of the interviews of Imelda, she actually said that I represent God. I make God real. That's her exact words, no. I make God real. Isn't that interesting, no? How they try to tap into the mythological culture of the Filipinos, no, in order to consolidate. So that is of course just part of the consolidation of power, no. The other part of it is of course the military, no. But if you show this to people in provinces, for example, where we like stories and we like, no, that's why so many people now believe in the Talano gold, no, even if it's obviously it's fake, no, because the myth is out there. So they were able to use that politically, no, and that has parallels in the Bible as well. So very, very interesting concept there. Anyway, I've digressed too much. Any questions before we go on a break? Wala na? Okay, sige. Let's do 15-minute break, and then after that, we will do some reporting. Is that okay? So you will present your structure and make some comments about your observation on the Decalogue, no? Because I asked you to look at the 10 verse at 10. The Decalogue, by the way, is the 10 commandments. No, it's the Decalogue is what? I think it's Latin. No, Decalogue is Latin. No, so it's the technical term that they use for the 10 commandments. So when you're reading scholarly material, they refer to it as the Decalogue. Okay, so we'll come back at, so it's 3:50. Let's come back at 4:05. Okay? Okay. Okay. So, well, just to uh, do a little bit of um, follow through with what I said earlier. So we will be doing rhetorical criticism, which most likely you are familiar with already in what do you call this, in hermeneutics, no? But it's not a skill that you you become very good at immediately. You know, it takes a lot of practice, like any skill. It takes a lot of practice to actually uh, refine it continuously, you know, and to be very sensitive in order for you to become a close reader of the text. Now, what we will be doing for the entire course, which we've already started doing, is to familiarize yourself with the material itself, point out salient characteristics that you can consider as you do rhetorical criticism, no, or literary criticism. At the same time, things from the historical critical perspective that you should include, like for example, we've already seen some aspects of ancient Near Eastern elements, no, that you have to consider when you're looking at it. So we're going to try to familiarize ourselves with the legal material. So we go through each of the chunk of the legal material. We do sample exegesis of those, because each of these chunk have their own characteristic as well. No, it's not like the narrative where more or less you can study character in all the narrative, or no, the materials in the legal materials are not homogeneous in terms of form and content, no. um, so it's more of a familiarization of what's there, some of the major characteristics of these materials, and the things that we have to keep in mind as we go through the material, no, for us to really appreciate. And of course, because we want this to be useful, we want to look at it from the perspective of ethics as well. In fact, very interestingly, if you talk about Old Testament ethics or even biblical ethics as a larger category or discipline, no, even if we don't deal with the legal materials very often in churches, in preaching, in teaching, no, in the field of biblical ethics, it's usually the legal materials that they go to. No, interestingly, no, and there's a lot of reason behind that, no, because usually, like I said, the ethics of the community is usually shown first and foremost by the laws that they have, right? No, it talks about your values, what you what you consider as important, no? And this is negotiated by the community, right? So, for example, even if uh, I, I, I'd like a certain injunction, no, because I'm progressive, it has to be the injunctions, for example, about divorce, no. It has to be the community that decides that. So, what is instituted in the legal material, in the laws of a community, would would show what it values, no. And and so that's the reason why the legal material, the law, no, even in modern societies, are not static. It moves, it tries to improve. Because you're hoping that the community also will improve in terms of the things that it values, in terms of the ethics that it conveys. Of course, legally, you can just be as legalistic, no? Meaning you just comply with law. So if somebody killed someone, you apply the law to that person, right? Uh, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the person who committed the crime is actually, taking moral responsibility. Because as legal scholars say, the law is the minimum boundary of ethics. No, morality is a different thing, but you cannot also separate the two. No, to a certain extent, the laws will show to you what is important to the community. No, and that's what we will try to distill from the legal material. What is so I personally, I do believe now that these materials were included in the collection, no, during the time of exile, because they're trying to show what is important for them ethically. Okay, in a genre that is not necessarily very straightforward, because in the prophetic material it's very straightforward. It says, do not oppress the orphan, do not do this, right? You are judged if you do this. No, in the legal material you have to do a little bit of analysis in order to distill the ethics that would be very, very important. And part of our role as part of our job, of course, is to try to see how an ancient concept would still be very important to us. No? So if we look at slavery, what can we learn from that? No? So that the Bible becomes, even those elements of the Bible that we would not necessarily practice in terms of practice, would still give us insight that might be very important to our day and time. And in this way, we do away with what is usually done in church. No, they skip the legal materials because it's not, well, the usual justification is it's no longer important for us. Christ has redeemed us. The law is. No, I don't think the law was included for that purpose, no, for it to be rejected by by later readers. Okay. Sige, with that, let's start with the reports. So let's start with the group of Isaac. So we go by the order. Are you going to share something?
Yes, ma'am. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. So we'll be talking about the Covenant Code, and my group mates are as follows. Chao cannot join us today because she's battling COVID, so do pray for her if you have the time. So we'll just go through this quickly. In our structuring methods, we were just wondering what the rhetorical purpose of the entire Covenant Code had. So this is how we divided it in terms of by topic. So we had 7 units from altar laws all the way to laws on Sabbath and feast. So we just tried to divide it by the coistic laws. So there's always a main clause and there are conditional terms that follows the main clause. And that's how we divided it into 7 distinct parts with 7 major clauses. What is interesting here is we also noticed that there was a stylistic change. So from chapters 22 verses 18, it stops from being coistic law. So there's usually the word when for the first 2 chapters, but when you reach chapters 22 verses 18, it begins with a different formula, which is you should not allow sorcerers to live. Whoever lies with an animal should be put to death. So the conditionals have now been removed, so it becomes apodictic. Yeah, so it changes into a different type of formula. So we noticed that, and it made us wonder if there's redactional activity in terms of how the covenant code was placed in to Exodus. And we also noticed that it also interrupts the Sinai narrative. So it's a bit abrupt because we see here Moses trying to give the Ten Commandments, then suddenly the story stops with 3 chapters of different codes and laws. And the narrative resumes after this part. So those are some of the questions that we had in mind as we were discussing and structuring our the covenant code. So our next slide would actually talk about the comparisons we found with the Decalogues. So what's interesting is in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, we see that there's echoes of Egypt. So that premise is very clear and loud, and there are almost no textual differences. Actually, they're very similar. There are some slight changes that we did notice in terms of motivations. For example, for honoring your parents, Exodus 20 just says that your days may be long in the land. That was a motivational clause. And in Deuteronomy 5, it adds, and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord has given. So that's another clause of motivation for that particular part of the Ten Commandments. And for Sabbath keeping, there's also different motivations. For Exodus 20, it talks about a creational motivation that God created the world in 6 days and rested in the seventh, while Exodus talks about the motivation. Sorry, Exodus talks about that creational motivation, and Deuteronomy talks about them being as slaves. So to keep the Sabbath holy, to remember that they were slaves before. So there are different motivations here. And we also noticed that Exodus 34 is actually just a very bare representation of Decalogue. It only contains 3 out of 10, and it only focuses on covenant loyalty to God and keeping the Sabbath. So some of the explanations that we had in mind was probably the later dating of the D source or Deuteronomy source. So there are changes in terms of motivations, and there are reinforcements of certain laws because the law has been repeated twice in Deuteronomy. And there are also some changes in theological emphasis. That's question mark because we're not so sure with how it came to be. So our last slide will be more on the explanation of why these different decalogues the way it is. So it's a quest for historical dating. So we wondered if Exodus 34 is the most bare because it came from a J source. So perhaps it's a first edition. So there's only, it's the first draft of the Decalogue. So it's just very new and very bare. And what follows is the Decalogue that we know in Exodus 20. And the question mark here is this the first Decalogue? Is this the first time that the Ten Commandments was given? And it follows with the covenant code that we're trying to structure, because now we notice that there is redactional activity because it seems that it was spliced in to the Sinai narrative. And there are more sophisticated agrarian coistic laws. So obviously, they wouldn't have these sophisticated agrarian laws if they didn't live in a context of agriculture. And that doesn't seem possible if they're still wandering in the wilderness or if they were still in the process of the conquest of the promised land. So it seems that they've already been living in the land for such a time and experienced these conditions and these premises in terms of property laws and slavery laws. And they made this covenant code to correct those mistakes. And the last would be Deuteronomy, which is the latest type of source in terms of a documentary hypothesis as the second Decalogue. And we also see that there's some ethical developments. So in Deuteronomy 15:12, it adds a new clause to slavery laws. So not only should you let the slave go free in the 7th year, but you should not let him go empty-handed, but furnish him liberally from the flocks, threshing floor, and winepress. So that was missing in the covenant code. So now not only do you have to let him go free, but you have to give him material blessing. And we also see some changes in terms of the location of the sacrifice and altar laws in Deuteronomy 15:14. It is now a place that God will specify in the tribes of Israel, which was not mentioned in the covenant code. So that's our short report. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaiah. Isaiah, why did I have Isaiah? Because I was thinking I need to do something on the book of Isaiah. Very interesting, no? That you are, I think the reason why Isaac was approaching, or his group was approaching this from the perspective of the sources, no, to explain the differences. It's because of the effect of theology. One of you, actually, one of the questions that you would be asking if you were to look at it from the final form is, remember, in order for you to have the final form, there is an editor, the one who put together these sources, right? Now, why did he not just copy? Remember the Ezekiel. I mean, I'm still, my mind is still in the prophets. Remember in Exodus 20, the first Decalogue, and then this the reason why they had a second Decalogue in Exodus 34 is because Moses broke the first tablet, di ba? But there's a verse there that says, "I will give you exactly." No, and then what is given there is not exactly what it is. No, so from the final form, why did the editor not just, if there are sources, right? Why did the editor not just use the same source so that um it's good to chop it up in sources, but you also have to contend with the final form, no? Because the final form, the assumption there is they're finalizing it so that it's readable and it will make sense as a final form. No, I will leave that question hanging for a while, but it's very interesting, isn't it? We see we don't encounter the Decalogue a lot. We encounter it in the front of Catholic churches, no, they usually have two slabs of there with the 10 commandments. But you realize now that there are actually three versions of it. No, so you should compare, what exactly is being reflected when they talk about the Decalogue. I think it's usually the first one with a little bit of tweaking, from the contents of the others. Okay, we will talk a little bit more about the Decalogue later on. Now, I was very interested in what Isaac is saying, that you can sense the ethical development by looking at the sources, which sources come first. So you have three materials that are supposed to be decalogues, but they're different. And by using the timeline, if we will follow the timeline of Isaac, in terms of the order by which they were added, one of the contribution of source criticism really is to determine the progression of the ethics of the community that dealt with this. So if there's an improvement in the way they perceive ethics, and that's the reason why we know, in the Old Testament, these passages in Genesis that talk about the image of God, using source criticism, we know that is a very late development in the consciousness of the Israelite community. It's not something that was with them earlier on. No, it's a later development, and I think it became more mature. There's a better sense of what the other is, rather than just killing everybody. So the earlier materials talked about wars and things like that, but the Genesis, if we were to follow the source, the dating of the sources, that's a later material in terms of the chronology of the sources. And that will tell you one of the contribution of source criticism is it will give you the development of ethics, of the community itself, so that you can discern which ones why is there a change? Did they mature? Or did they become more barbaric as a community? Okay, you have to remember that they went through history as well, and the earlier forms of communities would be more engaged in more violent wars and things like that. So thank you for that, Isaac. But my challenge is, because we're doing this as well from a literary perspective, it would also be good to say what's going on here, as a literary whole. Of course, it's okay to always think of the sources, but it's not always the explanation for everything. It's a very good explanation what you did, but you also contend with the question, why did the editor not just use the same material? Right? So that it's so nice, it's so neat, di ba? He's saying that he's retelling the story of God giving them the Decalogue again. Why not reuse so that you have the same material? What does that say? What can we infer from those? Those are questions that you deal with when you are looking at it from the final form. Okay, but both are valid. The perspective of Isaac's group are valid. It's just that it's coming from a different lens altogether. Okay, sige, can we have the second group?
Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
Si medyo mahina. It's a little bit weak. I cannot ano. Can you hear him? Or is it
How about now, ma'am? Mas okay na po.
yeah, better.
Okay, for group 2, I'm with Pan and Rose, Kim, and Rowena, and Zim. I'm Zim. I'm the sacrifice of the group 2.
The
Okay.
offering
Yes.
for atonement.
And this is how we made the structure for Exodus 20:23 to verses 23 to chapter 23 to 19. We notice there is an exposition in verse 1, 27, on chapter 21, verse 1, and then we grouped it in different laws on how these laws are involved in different activities of the Israelites. And we also break them into, put them into groups like this. So there are laws involving worship, such as prohibition of idols and observance of altars and burnt offerings. And from there are laws involving slaves, different kinds of slaves, such as Hebrew slaves, bond slaves, and female slaves. And there's also groupings between laws involving violence and injuries to another person, which indicates different offenses and the penalties incurred for these offenses. And another group is the violence to another person's property, such as negligence, theft, property loss, and loans. And there are laws involving morality on chapter 22, verses 16 to 20. And this is a very brief laws on morality because it only states sexual intercourse of a virgin outside of marriage, and it gives a very brief abominable acts such as about sorcerers, sexual intercourse with animals, and sacrifice to other gods. So it's very a brief compilation, and in fact, we have the difficulty in placing these items in what group does it belongs. And then we have also group laws involving kindness for the vulnerable, and these are the strangers, the widows, and the fatherless, and of course the instructions for having compassion for the poor. And we have also group for the last part, laws involving the conduct and behavior, and it's on blasphemy, conducts on offering, self-preservation, being holy, conduct of justice, and laws against oppression to other people. And finally, the last part is the laws involving the observance of different ceremonies such as Sabbath, the feasts, and the offerings. And for the second question, we compare the Decalogue, Exodus 20, and then Exodus 34, and then Deuteronomy chapter 5. So the similarities that we notice is that the three groups, the three passages, indicates observance of the Sabbath, and it encourages loving God above all, and idolatry as unacceptable. There are, however, differences that we notice. Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 mention the entire Ten Commandments, while in Exodus 34 was a different because it only mentions laws on idolatry and Sabbath. Our attempt to explain this is it probably contains the detailed instructions emphasizing on the covenant of God for Israel and how Israelites should respond to this covenant on verses 10 to 11. God's statement of his covenant, laws on worship, laws on idolatry, laws on feast celebration, and laws on sacrifices. We also notice that Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 does not mention any laws regarding festivities and sacrifices. And probably Exodus 20 is a simple presentation of the Ten Commandments that appears to be a summary as these are expounded and expanded as codes in the succeeding chapters on different topics. And chapter 24 provides additional discussions about the observance of feasts. And last, we also notice that Exodus 34 mentions the observance of Sabbath very briefly, while in Deuteronomy it gives a thorough instruction. Moses in Deuteronomy 5 reminds the Israelites of God's covenant with them and provides detailed instructions on how to observe this requirements. And we also felt that Exodus 34 is more on me and God, our relationship between an individual and God. And like on the two chapters, it is more on me, God, and others, or it involves the community in terms of relationship. And that is our report for Group 2. Thank you.
Zim, how did you explain again the differences? What was I wasn't able to catch that.
The first differences that we noticed, ma'am, is
So you categorize the differences.
yeah, the first difference is we noticed that Exodus 34 do not mention, it only mentions laws about idolatry and Sabbath,
No,
unlike
so, but
20.
there was an explanation earlier about why do we not have the same decalogue for all three occurrences of it. I think it was the
Yes, this one.
uh
I think our attempt to explain this to mom is, I think Exodus 20 is a simple presentation of the Ten Commandments. It appears to be a summary of the entire commandments for the Israelites. And these are expanded and expounded into codes, or it breaks into different codes in the succeeding chapters. So we felt that Exodus 20 is just a kumbaga parang prologue siya, parang gano'n. Parang it represents the entire contents of the laws. Chapter 24, in fact, in 24, it provides additional discussions about observance of feasts.
Can you go back a few slides? Sige pa nga.
Ito ma'am, yung similarities po.
Yung next one, patingin nga yung next.
Ito po.
Wow. All right. Okay. But you did not really try to grapple with bakit kaya tatlong Ten Commandments meron tayo? So meron kayong explanation for each, no? That's what
Yes, ma'am, that's what we did.
Of course, that question is coming from the assumption of a modern reader, di ba? Kasi nga
Yes, ma'am.
tayo,
Yes, ma'am. I admit.
tayo, when you ask why do we have three versions, no? But you are assuming, because as modern readers, we like when you're saying A is A, it has to be A all throughout. When you use A in another book, it has to be A, right? That's a modern assumption, in fact. So this is one of those questions, no, that when you go back, what's going on with this community? No, why is A not A anymore when they are pertaining to A? No, it became A prime, and then it became another version again. Especially, the one that's very interesting is the two in Exodus, no, because the story, if you look at the narrative, in the story it says Moses will be given again the exact one, no, but then when the Decalogue is given in Exodus 34, it's not exactly the exact one. Right? So you have a narrative that makes you expect something. So from a final form perspective, you ask yourself, is there something here that I should understand from an ancient perspective, no, which defies what a modern expectation would be? Because in a modern expectation, because we write everything, no, we have a way to record everything. We have digital, when I say that, oh, these are my instructions, there are 5 of them. When you tell the person, when you relay this to the group, you have to read. Di ba? There's it.
Yes, ma'am.
So those are the things you ask yourself. No, is there something going on here that I'm not understanding? No, why they're all called Decalogue, but at least, well, Deuteronomy and Exodus 20, more or less, there's huge similarity. But 20 and 34 in Exodus, which you would expect would be more similar to each other, since it's a repeat, di ba? He's going to be given narratively. He's going to be given the same one. Anyway, very, very good, Azim. I do like that you try to deal with each individually. That's one good thing as well in hermeneutics. No, you don't just try to lump them together. that can be very dangerous. No, that you try to just have one big explanation for all. No, but what you try to do is to try to deal with each case separately, in order to give it justice. No. So that's one thing that we should be doing as well in hermeneutics. Okay. Thank you, Zim.
Thank you.
How about the last group? I will
Hello
comment
po.
on the... sige, Tim. Share ka lang habang nagsasalita ako. I will comment on the... Are you going to share?
For
Something?
group 3.
Yeah?
Yes po.
Sige, share ka lang.
For group 3.
Sige.
No. We will not screen share.
Okay, sige. You go ahead. I'll comment on the structure later, no? For all three of you.
Okay. Yeah, so for group 3, sorry, we did not think of making slides. I think our group was having some trouble identifying and defining what are the different types of legal blocks that we can see in the passage. So we did kind of spend some time trying to figure that out together. But from what we did discuss, I'll be talking about how we understood the divisions in Exodus 20 verses 23 to chapter 23 verse 19, and Kuya Chris will be next in talking about the differences in the various accounts of the Decalogue.
Mhm.
And so for my section, our group thought about seeing the passages as a series of casuistic laws that can also be grouped thematically based on various topics, as have been already mentioned by the elder groups: altar procedures, owning slaves, fatal violence, non-fatal violence, conditional laws, imperative laws, restitutionary laws, and social laws. And so rather than just list all the various cases and subcases that we found, I thought I would just focus on one in particular that I personally found interesting, and that is in chapter 21, verse 19, and the idea of compensation for non-fatal acts of violence. And what I found interesting here, as opposed to the preceding section, which is about preceding sections which deal with fatal violence, this particular case offers various subcases that offer both instances of injury to the victim that are non-fatal, but also incidents of property damage. And it is interesting here how slaves and the unborn are considered pieces of property that need to be compensated. And this reminds me of the Joseph Blakinskop reading, The Growth of Israel's Legal Tradition, where he talks about this being the only reference to quote unquote abortion as we may understand it today. And it's stemming from the idea of children being viewed as a valuable commodity that called for compensation if they were to be lost. Again, I know I am kind of starting to veer off into more historical critical lenses, but that was kind of, I guess, just triangulating with the readings that we already had, looking at these kind of sections made me think of that. And to further go into more historical critical ideas, I think that also looking at these sections made me ask how exactly we may understand the Israelite covenant code in relation to other ancient Near Eastern treaties, because I think one of the points of contention for me is how relatively humane and quote unquote progressive are these laws compared to their contemporaries or later contemporaries, those who would follow. And I remember Mom talking about how we can understand the covenant code, and maybe even more so later the prophets, as being more relatively humanitarian and socially progressive, especially in laws dealing with slaves and how people are to treat each other. But again, going back to the growth of Israel's legal tradition reading, the author actually talked about how the Code of the Covenant is actually relatively behind in regards to other ancient Near Eastern treaties. Him citing the laws of Eshuna, where the rogue ox in chapter 28, chapter 21, verse 29 actually led to a fine rather than the owner of the ox actually being killed. And the later Code of Hammurabi also showing more progressive stipulations for divorce. And so I think this is just alluding to the maybe the point of tension. And again, I know this is more from a historical critical perspective, but I think there is a point of tension of where does this covenant code actually stand in relation to the other contemporary societies, and how might we better understand Israel in relation to them by asking that question and finding insight into that question. So yeah, that's essentially my part for the legal section, and I will pass it on to Kuya Chris, who will talk about the 3 accounts of the Decalogue and the differences. So Kuya Chris, if you want to
Yes,
continue.
Tim. Okay, thank you. Some of our observations of the similarities and differences in the Decalogue, it's the 3 versions of the Decalogue. First, the Exodus 20 is the giving of the law for the first time to the Israelites. And in Exodus 34, the giving of the law in response of the people's idolatry, the golden calf incident. Moses broke the first version of the tablet that contains the law. And in Exodus and Deuteronomy 5, the context about the people probably able and ready to enter the promised land. And some of our observation, the similarities is the introduction of Yahweh, Exodus 20, verse 1, Exodus 34:10, and Deuteronomy 5:6. No? It's about the incomparable to the other gods. No? That Yahweh who do amazing work, amazing things. No? So, but the differences is about the or possible the how God saved his people out of slavery in Egypt and freed them. No? The next is the monotheistic, no? The Yahweh alone, no? This about the jealous character of Yahweh, that he insisted, no, that he was the not to join the community to worshiping other gods, but to Yahweh only. But the differences in Exodus 30 is about the social life of the Israelites may affect having one God in their life. Not to marry them, to marry to the other nation and destroy any altar dedicated only to the other God, but of course to Yahweh alone. The next is the law on Sabbath. The differences, the text shows laws on Sabbath, which each has a different reason for observing. Same to the group 1 in Exodus 20, keeping the Sabbath in remembrance of how Adonai created the world where he rested in the 7th day. But in Exodus 30, specify the act of harvest and plowing. And Deuteronomy 5 recalls what Yahweh has done for them. So it talks about again to the freed from their slavery in Egypt. The next is the social laws in Exodus 20. The Decalogue in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy were closely similar because of the presence of the social laws. And which is supposed to be the second version. Possible that Exodus 34, glaring difference because in ritual laws, traditions, and festivities. Since the Exodus 34 is after the Golden Cup incident, played a vital role in why the laws were different to the Exodus 20 and the Deuteronomy chapter 5. So somehow we discuss the similarities and differences doing personal observation of the text. Thank you, Papa.
Thank you, Chris. Actually, they try to grapple, no, from the perspective of the final form, following the narrative. So, so, so after the idolatry, the golden calf incident, why was it different after that? Is the golden calf incident, you think, relevant in terms of making the second Decalogue different? Do you see any hints at all in the narrative that might answer that? Did you see anything?
Probably, ma'am, because it aims to address the issues of the people.
Right. Okay. Okay. So instead of giving the just to address the issue of the people, he did not give the. Okay, that might make sense, no, from the perspective of the final form. Now, team, you don't have to apologize for looking at the ancient Near East. You're supposed to actually do that. Okay. In fact, most likely, Isaac is correct that one of the ways you can explain this is because of the sources, no. But at the same time, they really use probably different sources. At the same time, you would also ask, no, on the other layer of meaning making, you would also ask, why not just use another source, no? Why is it, no? But true that the differences is most likely because there are different sources. Do you see what is happening here? No, each of your explanation is trying to look at it from different perspective, and that's very, very good, no? For as long as you see evidence that will support your claim. And as long as you're very careful, no? For example, you can say it's possible, given this narrative context, that this is what's going on here, no? And you can explore that, for example, if you're doing some exegetical paper on it. Okay. Remember, in exegesis, we're depending on evidence, and it doesn't always mean that all the evidence will only point to one explanation. Life is too complicated, and this one represents the life of the community, right? It's really nuanced, so it's okay to look at it from different perspective. Okay, most of your structure, you try to make sense of the collection, diba? Why are they all put together? So group them, right? No, what are the similar themes that you find? How do you group the laws? It's so difficult, no, because it's like a random collection. Although you can discern groupings, did you notice that some of the groupings actually happen again? Now there's a repetition, for example, somewhere after many verses after. Did you notice that? So for example, let me just look at my For example, there, if you consider chapter 21 verses 12 to 17 as, let's say, categorize them as capital crimes. All of a sudden, there's capital crimes again in chapter 22. No, capital meaning it's punishable by death. So there's, after so many verses, it happens again, no? And what you all did is okay, no? At least you're trying to discern how are these grouped, no? And if you were in my class in hermeneutics or in narrative criticism, you know that for as long as there is enough evidence, we cannot really say that one structure is the best one, no? It can be for a one purpose of explaining the text depending on how you perceive the text exegetically. Okay, now let me present another way of looking at it, looking at other elements in the text. I combined other elements along with what you did, no? So in your case, you tried to group them. I grouped them as well because that's the most logical thing that you can see, right? There are laws that are obviously can be put together, like sabbatical rules about slaves. Of course, they go together, no? But just to show you that there might be other things that you can look at, okay? And this will enhance, again, let me share. This will enhance, again, close reading of the text. Can you see the PowerPoint? Okay. By the way, please share submit your PowerPoint, but please share that in the GC so that you can look at each other's grouping. Now it's interesting. Some of your groupings are similar, and then some you put together but thought of a different category as an overarching category for those groups. No, it's very interesting how you divided them. Okay, so the way I looked at it, the way I structure it is like this. No, of course I have the advantage of knowing a lot more elements and looking at the Hebrew as well. No, and that allows me to structure it a little bit different. It doesn't mean it's superior than yours. No, it's just structured differently. By the way, I hope I forgot what is in my notes. No, but I hope you went through it. But structuring is one of the most basic and very important parts of rhetorical analysis, no? Because it allows you to organize the material so that you see the themes that go together. How do they relate with each other? No, you see relationships by structuring. So this is something that is very important in exegesis, especially if you're looking at it from a literary perspective. So you will notice that it's like a, well, almost concentric, no, except so you have a prime, b, a prime, b prime, but in the middle it's a little bit different. No, you have c prime here with d in the middle, and e prime here with f here in the middle. Okay, you can go back to, I will provide you with the slides along with some of the notes, no, but please don't distribute them. So this is only for just to give you an example of how I try to make sense of the arrangements here, no. So looking at this material, the Covenant Code. By the way, this is one of the major group of materials in the legal material. Now, the Covenant Code is introduced by a narrative statement in chapter 20, verse 22. No, and Exodus 21 in the next chapter, you will notice that the first verse in chapter 21, the next chapter, interrupts the legal discourse with a title. No, there's a title in verse. Let's see, chapter. So if you actually have your Bibles with you, if you try to follow this one, chapter 21. Okay, there's a superscription here, no? Now these are the rules that you shall set before them. Okay, so you have a legal discourse prior, but then there's another introduction here. Okay, and from a historical critical perspective, the way you explain this is probably an indication that an author or an editor was aware that he's actually combining different sources, so different legal traditions were being combined here. No, so that's why there's an explanation there. There is a superscription or a title that interrupts actually the flow of the legal discourse. Okay. Now, if you look at the end, so that's what I was talking earlier about this one. Now, if you look at the end here, the A prime, the ending here is a speech, right? It's a speech which actually anticipates the occupation of the land by Israel. And if you look at the genre, the material here, you will notice that the rhetoric is different. No, it belongs to a different genre of lawmaking compared with the materials here. No, in terms of the formulation alone, the lawmaking that happens here is a little bit different. So in terms of form. So if you go back to that, you will notice the difference. Okay, so try to review that when you look at the slides again. Okay, now let's look at the different pieces. Okay, I'll try to discuss them together. So let's look first at A and A prime. Okay, so the two ends of the structure. Okay, now if you notice, the first one is against idolatry, and then followed by rules for building altars. And then towards the end again, there's something about idolatry. And then it's followed also by festival and sacrifices. So you have two parallels there. Okay. The two ends, this one, and this one are actually organized in very similar manner. Okay. They talk about rules about wrong worship. Okay, followed by rules to ensure right worship. Okay, so both of them, so you can compare them later. Okay, you can use this one later and really look at the text to see what I'm talking about. Now, if you also notice the form, most of these rules are written in the second person singular. Okay, those of you who are doing Hebrew, this is where your Hebrew will come in. Try to look at the elements of it. So most of these rules are written in the second person singular. The exceptions is 2023 Okay, 2023 and 2313. So this one and this one are the exceptions. No, they are second person plural. The ones that are against idolatry. Otherwise, everything else is second person singular. Okay? Most of this as well, most of this, the way they are stated, they are formulated unconditionally. It's not an if then. It's unconditional. It's not conditional. No, so your case law, that is what you were mentioning earlier as casuistic. No, it's conditional. But these two ends of the structure, the two ends of it, this one and this one, most of them are unconditional. Okay, so those are things you can compare as well. I think you saw that, no? You were trying to look at which ones are case laws, which ones are apodictic laws. We will discuss those kinds later on, or the different formulation. Okay, so that's A and A prime, the two ends of the covenant code. Now let's go to the inner part. Okay, let's go to here, B and B prime, and compare them. Okay, let me go to the slide for B and B prime. Okay, so if you look at the contents, they're not exactly the same, no? The first one are rules about slaves. The second one, the B prime, are sabbatical rules. However, there's something that bind them together. This is what we call the 6-7 formula. 6 days you do this. Okay, 6 days you do this. On the 7th day, this is what happens. Okay, so you have that consistency in both of this. Okay, and in terms of syntax, the first one is conditional. The second one, the one at the end, is unconditional. The main address, there's no consistency in terms of addressee. No, the first group is third person. The latter group is second person. Okay, now why is the 6-7, the 6-7 numbers? Why is this very, very important? No, this is very important because the 6-7 motif really recalls the rhythm of sabbatical observance. 6 days you do this, 7 days. On the 7th day you do this. Okay, so unlike the A and A prime, this structure is defined by similarities in content, no, the 6-7, but not in form. Remember earlier, the first one, the AA prime, it's very similar in form, right? They're both unconditional. They're all second person, although it varies, no? Second person plural, second person plural, second person singular, second person singular. So the form is very similar. Now here, in terms of content, there's similarity because of the 6-7 formula. Now in Hebrew, if you see certain formulas like this, no, 3 day for 3 years and for 4, and then for 3 years and for 4, you see that in the prophets, no, those are formulaic things, so that you have to pay attention to. Okay, so in the case of the first one, after a period of 6 years, in the case of the slavery, okay, after a period of 6 years, a 7th year of release is called for, no, in chapter 21, verse 2. Okay. Now, in Exodus 23, verse 12, it continues this theme, no, of observing 6 years and then 6 days and then the 7th. Okay, the weekly Sabbath. Okay, now the other thing that you can notice, if you look at it from a thematic perspective, both this group of laws, now the B and the B prime, these deal with economically distressed person. No? The slaves are economically distressed. Okay, and the sabbatical rule is a call for relief. No, you rest. Okay, and there's an economics behind that. No, it's not just you rest because God says you rest. No, so these are for economically distressed person, and we will look at that. Why are they being required to rest on the 7th day? Okay, why is it important to institute these laws? No, who is the most affected here? No, is it just whim? No, that so there's an economic reason to it. No, and it has to do with people who are distressed. Okay, so both this group of laws deal with that. Okay. Now let's look at so let's just go back to the main slide here. So the next one that I will zero in on, so we have the middle here, but I will look at C and C prime and then followed by D. Is there a relationship with the Jubilee years? Yes. We will go to that when we go to Leviticus. It's one of the my favorite concept in the legal material, no, the Jubilee year. I think something that we have to think about. How do we how do we follow the ethics of the Jubilee year in our day and context? Yes, it does, Isaac. Very much related to that. Okay, so let's look at C and C prime. No, now if you look at C and C prime, each rule here, each rule in this group begins with a participle. So those of you doing Hebrew, you look at this, no? Those who are reading it from the English version, especially a formal translation, that's why when you're doing exegesis, in hermeneutics, we say you use at least 3 formal translation and maybe 1 or 2 dynamic, no, meaning based. Because in the formal translation, it tries to capture the stylistic, no, as much as it can. Okay. Now, if you're looking at the English version, it the participial grammar here is captured by whoever. Now, that's the term there, whoever. And this one, the participial expression, describes the perpetrator. Okay, and it ends the formula with mot yumat, or in English, you shall be put to death. Okay, so you will see those formulate things. Now, Martin Boss, the mot yumat is a repeating term, no, when you are dealing with legal materials that has something to do with capital punishment, capital crimes, no, meaning the punishment is death. Okay, Martin Boss interprets mot yumat, that particular phrase, as he is liable for death penalty, which means, which indicates that the law indicates a right that can be exercised by the offended party. If you are the offended party, you can claim compensation by requiring death. No, however, evidence will tell us that even if there is a capital punishment injunction, evidence will tell us that it was not always necessarily implemented. No, not because that's the punishment, that actually in the reality it was always implemented. No, it's not. No, it's not always implemented. The law is there, however, no, as an option. Okay. Now, the crimes that are involved here are homicide, physical harm to parent, kidnapping, and cursing a parent. So more or less, you can see what kind of crimes are covered by capital punishment. Okay, all of these injuries were considered crimes against family. Okay, so these are crimes against family, and it is presumed that a family member would undertake the role of avenging the one who is harmed. Okay, so in the case of a murder, a concession was actually made in the case of an intentional homicide. Somebody mentioned that earlier, no? If it is an intentional homicide, the perpetrator could obtain asylum in one of Yahweh's cult places. No, it can be the high places, no, the places of worship. Okay, so they can go there until the process of adjudication will take place, no? Until there's like a formal hearing, not in the same way as we do it, no, but that's where they actually process the whole thing in front of usually elders, no, who judge the case. Okay, so that's C prime. Okay, so that is your this one and this one. Now, what is D prime? Let's look at D prime. Okay, now the rules about capital punishment, the framing, remember D is framed by C and C prime, no? So the rules about capital punishment, capital crimes in that frame, it frames a collection of laws written in conditional. So the D prime is conditional. Okay, so meaning it's casuistic law. If X, then Y. Okay, now I will not discuss this further because this will be one of the texts that we will do for the exegetical paper. This is one of the choices. Okay, but that it's framed by CNC prime. Okay, now let's look at this one, the EE prime, and then the F in between it. Okay. Where's the EE prime? There you go. Okay. Now, here, you will notice that the topic is oppression on both. No, it's oppression. And they're both unconditional. So in terms of form, they're very similar. And they're also both second person. Okay. So notice that the command not to oppress the alien, meaning these are foreigners within the community, is repeated here, 22:21 and 23 verse 9. Okay. And this repetition forms the rules. So it brackets the rules for social relationship. No, the what do you call this? The command not to oppress the alien brackets the rules for social relationship. Okay. Now the rules here, if you look at these rules here, this is what they share. No, what you see here as themes include concern for the landless person, meaning the ger, no, the person who doesn't have a land. There's vocabulary for oppression, no, it covers that theme. And then, as mentioned earlier, the motif of Exodus memory, it's also covered here, no, in this group of laws that talks about oppression. Okay, let's look at the middle portion, the middle of this one. So the F1. Okay, there you go. So what do we see here? There's rules on lending, there's rules on obligations, there's rules on parties at law. Okay. So if you look at this, these are laws against oppressing the socially marginalized. No, it talks about the rights and duties to socially marginalized. Okay, so if we look at this first one, lending, this one talks about relationship, how you relate with those who are inferior economically. Okay, now when you look at the obligations, this one looks at rules for the ones who are superior, the more superior one. And then this one, it looks at rules for peers, no, equal, your co-equal. So it talks about social relationship. No, in terms of syntax, it's not very even. It's not homogeneous. No, the first one is conditional. This is unconditional. This is unconditional. And the lack of homogeneity here is maybe possibly explained by the fact that it's dealing with either an equal, somebody is more powerful than the other. In the second one, it's zeroing in on people who are more superior. And then in the third one, it talks about peer, no, your co-equal. But in terms of the addressee, the one who is being addressed, they are all in the second person. Okay, so that's how what I'm just trying to say is there are other elements that you can also look at that might help you explore further, no, or put more detail into your grouping of the material. Okay, it does not necessarily mean that this is more superior. It depends on how I'm going to use this, structure as I lay out my exegetical paper. Okay, because the structure is supposed to help you put out there or explain your exegetical paper, no? Because you're looking at relationship of the laws. So if you're just organizing it thematically, that's also okay. That's also okay. Okay, so I will stop here. Any questions so far? Any questions? Okay, so the one that I I hope no na from the way I structure the text, you can see that it's not just thematic that you can look at. There's other possibilities. In fact, there might other be details that I did not in fact include because it will not help my structuring anymore. But it might help your structuring. Di ba? So the goal here is to closely read the text so that you try to consider the elements that might enrich your reading of the text. So I followed your grouping in the sense that I looked at the themes that are covered, no, but I also looked at syntax. I looked at whether it's case law, no. I looked at the addressee and things like that. Okay, now this might not always work for materials, for example, in Leviticus. It might only work for this particular set of material, specifically the covenant code. Okay. Now the next one that we will look at is the slavery law. So just to do a sample, let's do a sample of one of the laws and what can we learn from that. Now, just to give you a paradigm in terms of how do we deal with these different sets of laws in the covenant code, and that will be part of your exercises for next week. Okay, which will be asynchronous, by the way. We will not be meeting. Okay. So tinulugan nyo na yata ako. You slept on. This is the reason why I don't want to give out my notes. No, I should really follow Ma'am Athena's style. No, si Ma'am Athena, she gives what they call this handouts. What does she call them? Parang handouts, but you fill in the detail. No? So may mga bare. She will just provide some points there, and you fill the other parts. I should do that, no? So that you will listen to me. But I will provide the slides for this, no, so that you can be reminded of other things that you can look at. These are skills that you can improve as you repeatedly deal with the text. No, if you work on the legal material more frequently, then you will easily notice things that occur very frequently. The formulas that happen very often. Okay. Okay, sige. If there are no more questions, we will not meet next week. So you will just be meeting with your groups. I will record a lecture that you will watch and some readings that you will read. I hope you're reading the readings, because there's so much material that we need to cover. And I don't want to be meeting you every week, not just for my sake, but I know you you also want some break every now and then. So I'm relying on you to be responsible and do the reading so that whatever we cannot cover in class, it will be supplemented by the reading. So the readings will be very important as you reframe or you direct your minds into being more sensitive to the materials that we are dealing with. Okay. Sige, maraming salamat. I'm hoping to see some of you tomorrow. If not, I will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sige,
Sige po.
bye-bye.
Thank you po, ma'am.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.